Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. On this episode, a frank discussion on race, politics, immigration, and reparations with Lord Sewell of the British House of Lords. This is one for the books. Are minorities the true underperformers in the UK? The numbers say otherwise. We are bringing the hard facts on the racial divide and addressing the real factors, such as family and socio-economic conditions that are the actual determinants of success for people of color in Britain and the USA. We also tackle the growing reparations movement in the UK and how this dangerous line of thinking was exported abroad by individuals in the movement from the Caribbean, who are more British than those they are chastising. Is a colonial past really to blame for stagnation in the Anglophone Caribbean, or is it a lack of pragmatic governance? The answers and more in this episode. Without further ado, our final talk for 2024. Thank you so much, Lord Sewell, for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to talk first about your program, Generating Genius, because there is actually a similarity between us in that sense. So I run a program at the Mercator Center called Emergent Ventures Africa and the Caribbean, where we provide grants to persons primarily in Africa and the Caribbean doing different innovative projects, mostly science, it also be policy, it can also be artistic works and so on. So we have a very particular interest in essentially generating genius or finding talent. And I was very curious what led you to start this particular organization in the UK.
There were two things that drove this, really. One was programs that maybe were kind of targeting, for example, Black children or Black young people in particular, tended to avoid the sciences, or that didn't really come up in their thinking. I mean, the programs rather in sports, a lot of art stuff, development of leadership, but not science itself and technology and how that works and how you can link to science industries and STEM careers and develop yourself as a scientist. So that was one strand. I saw there was a gap. The second was the existing programs out there in the UK tended to be one-off things. So they tended to be things that were just done in the summer with a group, and then that was it. It was done or a week or whatever. What I was interested in doing was doing a program which was about nurturing the same individuals over a long period of time. And for me, a long period of time would have been 6 or 7 years. So staying with those same students and actually watching them grow. These programs tended to be called pipeline programs. And I saw these operating in America. What happened was the same group would keep coming back to the university or to the college every year. And that cohort then grew in the program. And I thought that was a very attractive way of working because you could then monitor change and really be effective. It had issues in terms of scale, but I thought I would do that. So that was the key motivators for doing that program. And in the background to that, and I'll tell you why Generating Genius has changed now. At the time, and we're talking about back now, 2002, something like that, the numbers were still quite significant around African Caribbean boys being the key issue that in the country in terms of achievement. So that was, again, another reason to respond to that group specifically. The numbers showed that. So those are the key reasons for the program.
I hear frequently from UK commentators that Afro-Caribbean males tend to underperform in the UK. But I remember a similar statistic in the US where Afro-Caribbean, the group, tend to outperform other groups in the US. Why do you think is that disparity?
Yes, it's really strange. I mean, when you start trying to unravel this whole thing with these labels to say an American audience, particularly a Black American audience, you have to do a lot of explaining and unpicking as to the complexities of the issue. I would say the easiest way to look at this is to look at the situation of those children who are from Caribbean origin, i.e. those children whose parents came here in the 1950s or grandparents came here in the 1950s to Britain, and a persistence of that group doing poorly in school. That seems to be comparable with African Americans in the sense, not all African Americans, but that sort of similar kind of framework. What tends to happen then is that the Caribbean group that migrates to America, it tends to be not always middle class, maybe in that sense, that helps, but they've had a history really of outperforming the African American in America. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is that the group then in England becomes a kind of poorer group from the Caribbean, and then they link into that poverty strata that's in Britain and never really break out from that. And so, in a sense, they have more allegiance really with the white working class in terms of what happens here. And so you then have the two kind of groups coming out of the Caribbean, but with different trajectories. One, almost a model Black group, migrant mentality, and another more indigenous group, if you like, doing poorly in the society. I do think there's a sort of strange issue there where it does seem that the more indigenized you are in the in the society, the worse you are, really. And it's the ones that actually have what I call this distant migrant kind of aspirational drive that do well. So, for example, the Nigerian group, the African group, would be the parallel of the Caribbean group in America, whereas the Caribbean group in Britain would be the parallel of your poor achieving African American group, you see? So what this all shows us is that we can't use these very simple generalizations about Black or whatever we want to call, because Black groups in many cases are operating at different levels. Some at an elite level, some at a low level. So the inter-groupings are much more kind of interesting in a sense than the idea of saying Black versus white, which probably is a generalization, doesn't make any sense.
So on that point of the, let's say, the indigenization of underperformance, in the US, for example, again, you have different groups. You have also the Asian Americans who were there for a pretty long time, third, fourth, fifth generation, and they still tend to outperform in terms of education in this particular case. Why do you think is especially UK still you have this persistent underperformance of the Black population, even especially Afro-Caribbean, as a kind of inculcation of culture in the UK?
Remember, the group that we're talking about is specifically Caribbean. We know it by the data. It's very easy to show. It's illuminated better once you see the African group, particularly West African group, Nigerian, Ghanaian group, doing so much well. They're on the parallels with the Indian and Chinese groups in Britain. And what it does is it exposes, I think, a number of things. You look at the family patterns of that Caribbean group, and I'll give you some numbers here. The Caribbean single parent is running, your parenthood frameworks, family structure is running at around 68, 69% of the population. Compared that to the Nigerian Ghanaian group that's running about 30%. And then the white group somewhere in the middle. And then the Indian group, something like kind of about 10%, and Chinese 8%. Clear parallels between strong two-parent family structures, and education achievement. And I would say for me, that is the key driver of this disparity.
Mm. That is not a very widely held view, I assume. I know there's a similar argument often made in the US as well. What this family structure comment. Why do you think people tend to try to disregard that particular view of performance?
Because politically, there's almost like an ideological drive to look at the school. I'm not saying that this isn't important. Schools are important, but to look at the school, to look at wider racism, to look at systems, and what that political ideology then does, and it's probably of the left, is that it sees any kind of analysis that looks either at the family or the culture as blaming the victim. And they don't really then see the more important issue that your family nurturing is going to be the determinant. The other thing interests me is that it also links to wider issues like crime, mental health. These are all key. So when health practitioners are trying to outstrip why disproportionate groups are in their systems, they keep going back to levels of structural or systemic racism. Now, to me, I do think people experience racism, of course. You have this problem of the African group would experience that as well, and the Indian group to a certain extent. And yet they're the ones who are flying off the charts in terms of achievement. So I do think that argument is only put out because people don't want to go down or ask the harder question for whatever reasons of really an agency that is needed in terms of people and their families and groups and their families. And until you deal with that, I think these things will persist.
Hmm. So expanding that now to the wider conversations you raised of racism, structural or perceived structural in different societies. When you were chair of the commission in the UK and you try to examine these issues, the resulting report caused quite a big stir, to put it mildly, in the UK, which to me as an outsider, of course, I was very surprised by. I figured, okay, it's actually a very good result. Why are people so angry at this result? Where it made the point that the idea of structural, the perceived idea of structuralism really isn't valid as a critique of modern UK society. Could you just walk us through what the report really went to details on, and why was this such a very harsh reaction to it? I would say this would be a good result.
I think somebody said to me that it was all about the timing. Probably had we done the report a lot further away from the George Floyd thing, which was really running around the world, really, in terms of what is now really, I think, completely disproportionate and ridiculous reaction, that people had to this symptom. But because people were in their passion, and then, of course, the other thing was we had structured, also institutions in Britain reacting from BBC to everybody just said, find me something black. The performative thing was just going crazy. It was almost like a witch. Everybody was saying, what black thing are you doing? And that performative thing of Black Lives Matter came along. So here then arrives on the scene for the first time in Britain, a report on racial disparity that was headed by a black man, and also the team was predominantly Black and Asian in terms of representation. And so immediately just the optics of that was important, because usually in England for a long time, a lot of our government reports were not really written or read by Black people or Asian people. So it's really interesting. So you imagine now that comes out, and in the heat of the moment, taking the elixir of all that kind of passion. And then we come along with an antidote that says, wait a minute, this is more complex. It is more complex because the disparities are driven more by geography, family structure, socioeconomic situations, all these other multiples, than it is by race and racism.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we included the white group in our analysis as well. So a lot of the time, people would look at these things, exclude the white group. And then, of course, it was very positive because it emphasized agency in there and saying, here are the enabling factors or disabling factors, particularly in health. These were linked to your own behavior rather than somebody who was the subject of racism.
Mm-hmm. Given the results of that, people would obviously say, okay, well, if the point to make there's no overall measure point of racism, then how do you get the underperforming groups, which are minority groups, to perform better? What kind of specific policies would need to be enacted for those people?
I think you're asking the wrong question here, because could it be that, in fact, and if we look at the numbers, that Caribbean group is so small now, tiny, that really the achievement issues are basically around the white poor majority. First of all, the starting point isn't even about race anymore. The starting point should be about this big group that's underachieving. That's where you want to put your resources and your emphasis. And that, in fact, their underachievement is to do primarily with aspiration, yes, family structure as well, but also a kind of attention and a kind of resource that London children have. And those children who live in the north of England and the south coast just do not have that access. That's really where the problem lies. England's a funny place because London is a small country, and yet London dominates everything. So you imagine now, as a magnet, all the best teachers across the country, particularly young teachers, get qualified, and they don't want to go into a small town or up to the north or to the south. They all pile into London. London is where the action is, best restaurants, those kind of things. And so we have a problem in the sense of attracting enough teachers into these needy areas.
And what's the corrective mechanism for that?
What's got to happen is we've got to do what we did, because London wasn't always as good as it is now. And I think you've got to do is ruthlessly go into these schools and put together a program of high achievement, aspiration. It's not complicated, but then you've got to also look at the leadership of these schools and come up with a framework that gets rid of them and puts in teachers that can do the job. And so there's got to be the movement, county by county, area, town by town, where you go in, you look at the results and you say, right, okay, we're going to do a transformation here via looking at your leadership, looking at your action plans to make your school better. And I think that so far, both parties have been reluctant to undertake it. And my sense is that one of the reasons why they don't want to do it is that those areas in themselves haven't got the kinds of social capital and people who could lobby for them. So, for example, what's ironic is that in London, why things went well, but our resources came to London, was that politicians lived there, Parliament was there. So, in effect, there was enough will and drive in those. Now, what I find is that those poorer areas outside, predominantly white, of course, outside them, don't have any of those sort of things going for them. And so they're left to wither on the vine. And I think there's got to be a different way of working with those communities, those schools, those academy chains that are in that area to up their game and really follow a model of saying, look, these poor children, even though they're poor, they can get to Oxford or Cambridge or whatever job they need, skill base they need to have. And I don't know, I just don't think that those areas have the ambassadors to be able to go in and really help those communities. So that would be my plan. My program, Generating Genius, is something that almost lays on the side of those schools because it's a kind of career advice aspiration program. And funny enough, we now target predominantly white schools. We've shifted the whole thing. So my sense is that it's almost like doing a missionary kind of job. It's coming out to those equivalent of your Rust Belt areas, not just the kids, but the modeling of the schools and how they work, and twinning and or sharing best practice with those schools, predominantly white, to help them. So this is a world away from when I went to school, where we had all the hardship. The schools are really difficult, and predominantly black kids failed. I think we've reached a point now where it's almost the other way around, where we've got a lot of high achieving, black and Asian children, and then their parents. And I always wonder, one of the things that could be done is just almost, as it were, that cohort, those schools, now saying, well, we've got to save the rest of the country, and going out to the country. And it puts a completely different dynamic or power dynamic on race, because in the end, what you've got is predominantly Indian and African parents, groups and teachers and great schools going in and helping and supporting predominantly poor white schools. It almost is as if we've come to almost a counterintuitive way of looking at social justice. And in fact, the power broker in education for social justice are black groups. They're not the victims. The country needs to call on them to go and help the rest of the nation. Because the discourse in the past has always been that the black group is in need, the Asian group, everyone's in need for the rest of the country to come to it. They do well. But this is saying, no, the numbers, the data show that, particularly, as I said, in the African corner of the space and the Indian corner, there is this sense of high achievement and success. The calling is then, and I think it's quite exciting to say this school with these children and these teachers need to go and help these children in predominantly white areas.
Wow. Yes, very counterintuitive indeed. When it comes now to broader politics in the UK, so shifting a bit away from education, there is now a very fervent race-based discussion yet again in the UK surrounding reparation policy between the UK and the Caribbean. And, honestly, to me, this is not a surprise based on what I read and write on the Caribbean side of reparation policy. But I am honestly very surprised the traction it has gotten in the UK itself, again, as an outsider. Before we get to the core reparations politics issue in the UK, why do you think this topic has now become so widely discussed in the UK? I understand why the Caribbean discuss it, but why in the UK?
Comes out of a lot of that stuff that happened after where there was a sense now that institutions, individuals were looking inwardly, and particularly like the Church of England, the BBC, even the Guardian newspaper itself, and finding these problems that were hidden or not in their own institution. And that problem for them was the notion of slavery and how to then deal with that. So I think that that's been the examination. The reason why it's now driving upwards as an issue for me is, I think, to do with the fact that we have had for a long time a narrative in Britain that's about self-hate, about the fact that you don't like your country. Britain is a place, you don't sing a national anthem, you don't have any pride in it because it's done wrong. It is associated with that inside England. And so it's almost like this kind of strange kind of contract people have with the nation, and it's similarly with the royal family. It can see that it's very attractive to the wider world and to individuals. People come here with them. At the same time, it indulges itself, but especially via the media, into sort of some self-loathing that says it's not really that great. And I think that's part of the Trojan horse, the way in really for this kind of idea. It's weakened, and then it comes. And then I think the third thing is to do with the lobby groups themselves that perpetuate this. Many of them are desperately trying to find some reason for their existence. And I think that's probably been the major reason why the reparations thing has taken off. There's been a popular kind of movement amongst academics, not about the real people, at UWE in the University of West Indies. And again, these people I knew in almost back in the 70s and 80s, and right now waving the flag. So I do think that's part of the reason why.
And now that it is a popular, generally popular conversation in the UK, do you think there's a way to essentially step back from it? Or do you think the only way to dissipate the conversation is some kind of either symbolic or some kind of active policy from the current government? Because oftentimes in these situations, stepping back is often quite difficult.
To step back is hard in the sense that if you take the Commonwealth, for example, Britain is still linked to institutions that if they step back, they step back at their peril, because it's all driven by the monarchy and things British. And if suddenly you decide that you don't want to do it anymore, then the whole thing collapses. In my view, I think that there should be a sense of focus on schools, universities, those two big spaces, and allowing a more plurality of voices in there than the single one we've got at the moment.
How realistic is that? Because at least from what I've been told from, especially from friends who are in these particularly more influential universities, there doesn't seem to be much space for plurality, even plurality of views at this point in time.
You know, it's quite interesting. And I was thinking about this the other day, that the left talk about postmodernism and intersectionality. They use these terms. Obviously, what they're trying to do is say that the world is being driven by white privilege. But essentially, that's no different than what we're saying, because they're saying that what you should not do is hold on to analysis of the world and say it's a fixed, immutable kind of way of looking at life, and that what you need to do is to take on different perspectives. Yeah. Except in their case, the taking on the different perspectives means for them their own and not anyone else's. So even though it's got a sense of fairness and it's quite attractive, I'm talking about some of the postmodern progressive stuff, it doesn't take us anywhere, because they refuse to see how it's relevant when it comes to disrupting completely reparations or any other argument. They're not going to turn up to class that day. And I think that's what you've got. I think the other thing is, I do think that Britain itself needs to build back its confidence that it can go in and speak to people and not worry about saying the wrong thing or whatever. I do think that that's slowly happening, but I wish it happened in a greater space.
Do you think there's something that needs to be somehow transformed in a similar way in the Caribbean? Because it was the Caribbean academic, the Caribbean politicians, the Caribbean different groups that really ignited this conversation over
Yeah.
many, many years. It didn't start functionally in the UK itself. It's really Caribbean origin. No, you're currently in the Caribbean, but do you think there's something that has to fundamentally change on the Caribbean side in parallel to changes in the UK side?
You're talking about reparations here, are you?
So, yes, but also in general, yes.
I do think that often the reparations argument, when it's run inside the Caribbean, and especially in Jamaica, is run as a decoy so that people can't focus on the real problem of roads and water, which is the bane of your life here. And I do think that a conversation or an image or a post that keeps you focused on this idea that you, like the children of Israel, you will go to this Zion. I think that's great as an image, but it's not going to work in the Caribbean. We need more pragmatic leadership.
And in terms of leadership in the UK, now there's a lot of excitement around Kimmy Badenoch as the new leader of the Conservative Party, in sense from her own idea of renewal and progress.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic?
I'll declare my colors here. Kemi and I are friends, and she was very supportive of us when we did the report. Came out as almost like a one-woman army and fought all the kind of nasty things that were said and how it got personalized and things like that. And she went in and she stamped her authority and created the government response, Inclusive Britain. I wish and I hope that Kemi doesn't bog down in race anymore. I wish she needs to meet the needs of everybody. And believe it or not, everybody isn't necessarily interested, no matter what, about race. And so I'm hoping that she does lay a vision about how government can effectively do things. Because what was clear about previous governments was that they were hampered by their environment or by land choices, things like that. So what I think she could do, which would be great, is to allegedly, she says, throw them in jail. Now, I don't think you get in trouble for doing that, but certainly prune back heavily some of the wastage already in the Home Office. I think she'll be able to do it. She's got time to do it, and she'll be able to do it.
Okay, that sounds quite good. So, final question. Why is it important to you to frequently travel to Jamaica?
For me, there's a connectivity here. And what I first thought was great about Jamaica, and it's very interesting that once we had the trauma in the 60s and 70s of being the first generation of Black kids born there and having the racism, Jamaica almost became an outlet, a kind of a place of refuge, an ideal that you could look towards. It's really funny. People even became fake Jamaican in order to survive the hostility. I wasn't a fake person, but I think Jamaica is a place that had that strength, mainly, of course, driven by its music and its culture, which is very attractive. I think I came here then, and it's interesting because I'm writing a film at the moment called Britain, the Making of the Jamaican Mind. What it does is it asserts this notion that Black people in Jamaica, as it were, are really Black British. They're goldfish in a British pond. They're surrounded. And so when I came here, wasn't necessarily, I'm going to discover all my African roots and all that. What happened, and I look back now as an older person and found the positive elements of Britain inside the region. The education system, the parliamentary system, the legal system, keep going. The football teams that they support, the side of the road that they drive on, just keep going. Even the language. It wasn't necessarily, here was a country now that, in a sense, was hating England. They had redefined who they are, who they were, but via a British and you could say an African, but essentially the British thread was there. They were just refining it so that it made sense for them. But the only thing they had really to use, the structural big tools, the water in the goldfish, was British. In a sense, I may have escaped home only to return home again. I'm now sitting, talking to you, looking at Goldeneye on the north coast of America. And that was the place where Ian Fleming wrote all the Bond novels. I suppose Chris Blackwell takes it up and does similar. Would come here 6 months of the year and actually get inspired by Jamaica to create those things. So the place couldn't be that alien that he could find it to be a nurturing environment. So he settles in here and finds another home. And even though the Bond films, I've done a couple of them, are really about Jamaica itself, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it provides the creative kind of seeds and context and nurture for him to go on and write those stories. For me, the surprising truth about Jamaica, it's not its contrast to Britain, but just how similar it is, how it's taken the best of Britain rather than something that it has to escape from. Barbados is another interesting, although we're not talking about Barbados. I know it didn't like the tag Little England, and it tried to fight against that. And so some of this stuff that's going on now is really a fight against that label in a way, trying to become now, I don't know, an Africanist sort of thing. And a lot of that stuff's performative because essentially Barbados did its best on the world stage when it was Little England. It had fantastic education. I'll be honest, people won't like this, but really that West Indies cricket team, you could put a Barbados one in and it would still win for a country so small. And of course, on the economy, they did really well. And everything was framed around Britain. The lie about that Little England thing was that Bajans weren't doing this because they felt like they were sort of submissive or they weren't as aggressive as the Jamaicans were. It wasn't, I don't think it was about that. I think the Bajans I've known over the years are very proud. What they found was that they could be proud of the best that the British left. And that's the key into this. And so that reparations, that anti-colonial thing that goes on, tends to miss that point that what we're finding here and what we should preserve is the best. I mean, there's some real ironies. All of those big Caribbean anti-colonial figures, C.L.R. James, Marcus Garvey, Michael Mann, Forbes Burnham, all these, they are Englishmen to the core, and they have a great affection for things British. This is the irony of it all. They appear on the one level to be this kind of, oh, we can give the colonial master a big kick in. And at the same time, they're lovers of that culture that makes them who they are. You see, the problem is with anti-colonial project is it doesn't share that part of it. It's around the corner, it's hidden around the corner. But I can, as a Black Brit, I could see through that. So when I read Garvey, when I listen to Michael Manning, when I look at Forbes Burnham, I have a special insight because I can see the two things operating at the same time. And it's only a Black Brit really who's up for it and see that contradiction going on. And it's all laid out then. So what is this thing about? What are we fighting in the end? So the battle then becomes, I think, performative. It's
Mhm.
all about, well, today we're going to look like we're anti the monarchy, we're anti this, but yet we're so British. And I think that story needs to be told. And for me, I think what people are frightened of is that they think that by opening up themselves to their British heart, that somehow they're going to be swamped by an anti-colonial British kind of thing. But in fact, far from it. It's actually the seeds of your creativity. I'll give you one example. I did some great projects in Jamaica about Shakespeare. I did we had a Shakespeare competition, and the kids loved the plays because what Shakespeare is, if you look at those plays, they resonate straight into the Jamaican context, and the kids relate to that. Chaucer is the similar thing. The wife of Bath, to me, she's like a dancehall queen. The medieval stuff that's going on
Right.
is similar to what you would see in downtown Kingston. The raw openness of that culture is very similar. So once you start stacking it up, people have got stereotypes of what is British, which is stiff upper lip, racist, I don't know, kind of aloof elite. Yeah. And that isn't Britain. That's just a kind of a stereotype of Britain. The Britain of Chaucer, of Shakespeare, is, I think, closer to the real Britain that you get, And that is even closer to what you see in the Caribbean. And Derek Walcott and C.L.R. James would tell you about this. Walcott has a lovely phrase where he said, in the morning, I've got a heartbeat of Ashanti and Warwickshire at the same time. I'm up for a kind of completely new evaluation from Britain to stop running itself down by telling itself and also the Caribbean that somehow it either owes them something or it should be ashamed of its culture. The opposite should be happening. And I think that that's the radical step that we need from intellectuals.
Mhm.
And that is going to enhance the Caribbean and also make people in Britain from all cultures feel that, not that they're going to forget the negative things that happen, but see the complexities of that interaction.
I'm from Barbados, and that reminds me of a point that El Barro, the father of Barbadian independence, he frequently argued when he was pushing for independence that in a strange way, they wanted independence because they're British. He used the point that the Parliament of Barbados is the third oldest continuous parliament in Western Hemisphere. And the reason why that is because the Parliament in the 1500s, they pushed against Cromwell and became a lot more independent from the Cromwellian court. And that was the continuous thing. So he said, we are the heirs of that Parliament. So
That's
he
right.
used this idea of being anti-Cromwell, being anti-this, to actually be said, because we have that inculcation of that particular element of British culture, of politics, and of astute global relations, we should actually be pushing ourselves forward. And that is not nearly what the current sentiment is. But as you discussed quite clearly, when you think about the relation between Caribbean and British culture, it's a kind of like anti-Napoleon sentiment where we no longer need the universal civilization.
It's quite interesting. When I listen to Mia Motley
Hmm.
speak, I look at her through my Black British lens.
Hmm.
And I'm listening, though she's coming up with all the rhetoric around sword stakes need to be, she sounds like a hustler trying to get money out of the big
Yes.
step. I don't mind that. But what she is essentially is a product of what she is. Her schooling, her education,
Hmm.
the language in particular, the rhetoric, the whole thing comes out of an English private school.
We're right to LSE, exactly.
That's what she is. She come in here now and say, yes, I do agree that I have all of that, but I now want to do something politically around climate change and things like that. But you see, I actually think that's the decoy, because what she doesn't do is tell us about that stuff that's made her. That is her identity, as it were. So she can wrap herself up in whatever. She's a British woman.
Yes.
She would hate that if you said to her, all I can see is that you are British. Just face that. You're nothing else but British. Don't give me all that performative stuff, because that's all well and but all I can see in front of you is a very articulate British woman.
I made the same remarks about Henry Beckles as well, even when I worked with him. Just his posture, his speech, his way of looking at the world, is upper middle class, aristocratic British conversation.
Exactly.
They never point out.
And she would never be able to relate. She would argue that she perhaps could relate to the poor Bajan in Barbados, well, to a certain extent, but she's certainly not going to be chums with the poorer class in Britain. She's known with that British middle class, upper class. Beckles himself. That's where they fit.
That's right.
And you see, I think what happened with Barbados was that it's this thing about what happens is, and it comes back to Kemi as well, is the term that Signitia Fordham, the American anthropologist, used, called kinship culture. Yeah. And what happens in kinship culture is that it's the family. Me and you are black men, so we've got to stick together, come what may. If we put all our differences together, I see you in the street. As far as I'm concerned, you're kid. Yeah, I've got the completely wrong term. Sorry, it's not kinship culture. It's but it's kinship culture. It's called fictive kinship. Fictive kinship is what it is. The fiction bit of it, that's the beauty of it. The fact that it's all made up. It's a fiction. I haven't got really anything in common with you but the color of our skins. But we pretend that we've got this kinship together. So what Mia Mottley has to do, in a sense, is find a Pan-African kind of fictive kinship around blackness, around the world, or whatever it is. And it doesn't make any sense. In the end, the only thing she can go to is back to a kind of power relationship thing between the horrible colonial and the anti-colonial. And here's where the contradictions keep accumulating. That fictive kinship is not real, so it's made up, and she buys into something that's made up. But also, there's a sort of sense of agency. So here is an incredibly independent woman, probably the most independent woman on the planet. But when she starts talking about race and all these other things, she might as well be on the plantation, because she's this victimhood. Gives her no agency at all. She is the most powerful thing, and yet she's nothing. It's going on here. So it's all performative. It's all staged and not real, because she doesn't believe that, because she's not that. Hillary himself, a very proud man, he goes around as if he's king of the universe. But then when he's trying to hustle his reparations, he has to do this almost sort of barefoot boy on the plantation. So what are you then? So I think people need to be more courageous in exposing the deep contradictions inside, but they're only contradictions because they make them contradictions. And the lack of acceptance that basically Barbados and Jamaica are really black Britain.
I like that phrase, yes.
Yeah.
That phrase. So, thank you so much, Lord Sewell.
Yeah.
It has been a delightful and entertaining conversation.
Thank you.